Welcome into a Friday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden is with you. It's also a Valentine's Day edition of In Touch, and if you have a significant other of some sorts, do something special for them today if you haven't already. So you may already know this, of course, if you're watching this when this gets posted. Normally the shows get released early afternoon-ish, give or take a couple of hours, depending on, schedules and whatnot. But you'll notice that this show was released earlier than normal, as have some in the past. And that's because today I'm meeting my wife for lunch for Valentine's Day. Just a little, It's also yesterday, the 13th, was our 10-year date-iversary, if you will. Like, we've only been married for nearly 5 years. That'll come next month in March. But we began our non-married relationship back on February 13th in 2015, which, man, 10 years. Doing anything for 10 years is a long time. So welcome in Touch with Indiana Sports. Hope you're having a good week. Hope you've had a good week, and hope you're looking forward to the weekend, whatever it is you've got in store for yourself. Good stuff. Hopefully you got some fun stuff coming your way this weekend. Maybe you're going to take in some basketball. Maybe you're going to, take your wife, whoever may be, out on that Valentine's date that I just mentioned. But I've got a good show, hopefully a good show in store for you here today on a Friday, or whenever it is you're taking this in. Mike DeCourcy will make his debut today on the show, and very glad to have him. Had two different guests who had never been on the podcast this week. So shout out to Zach Osterman, and of course today, Mike DeCourcy, for giving me the time of day, and talking a little Indiana hoops, and more specifically, the upcoming coaching search for Indiana men's basketball. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Got a bunch of small little tidbit type things to get into towards the end as well, because I do feel like we've hit the coaching search pretty heavy this week, and I know as this progresses, more things will develop, and we'll be able to react to different things as they come out. But this is going to be a very lengthy coaching search, if you will. There'll probably be rumors here and there. I don't know how much stock to put into really any rumor that isn't something from one of the reporters along the Indiana beat. I've seen numerous posts and stuff elsewhere, and it's fun to look at those and see what people are trying to do. Usually I feel like it's trolling, and if that's the case, that's fine and dandy. Take that stuff with a grain of salt. People will do what they do, especially with big programs like Indiana, especially for basketball. You're always going to get the nonsensical joke trolls that try to get fans to take the bait one way or the other. And of course, that's usually with Mr. Stevens from up in Boston. You can throw some of the other really big names that are probably impossible, the Billy Donovans of the world. I don't think people have really thrown around Billy Donovan's name as much this time around when it comes to the Indiana job, and rightfully so. There probably won't ever be a coaching search where you don't hear he who shall not be named. I guess if we go back to doing that, I feel like I'm wearing that out, so I won't do that a bunch today. But there will never not be a coaching search where his name is not at least mentioned in some way, shape, or form. But we'll talk about more of that with Mike DeCourcy. And so this conversation, comparing it to what we talked about with Zach Osterman on Wednesday, that was more of a kind of a coaching candidate profile and who kind of fits the bill or who Indiana may pursue. We dig into a little bit of that with DeCourcy, but it's more, big picture stuff when it comes to, the importance of the hire. Like what's kind of the most important trait, I'll say, when you're looking for somebody to take over a program that's gotten it wrong so many times since the Tom Crean era. And not that the Tom Crean hire was wrong. I'm not trying to say that at all. But since Tom Crean no longer worked for Indiana, because that that was a regime that had plenty of ups and downs, and I was gonna say more ups than downs, but honestly, I don't remember exactly how many years Tom Crean was with Indiana. I think it was 9 or 10 years. Man, I feel like it was longer than that in some cases. But I feel like most of the time the teams were either really good or sometimes really bad. And especially the early ones, those are kind of outlier seasons when you think about how bad they were. You can't uninclude them or remove them. But those were the days back when you couldn't immediately flip a roster. You had to be a lot more patient before you could get the results you really wanted. That's not really the case anymore. And so yeah, since Tom Crean, Indiana hasn't gotten it right. Archie Miller, of course, a swing and a miss. Now Mike Woodson, a swing and not as big of a miss because there was some success early on. But things and really, I mean, all the teams have kind of been in that same ballpark. And I know we've talked about that before, but yeah, Mike Woodson just about as mediocre, I guess you can say, as you can get when it comes to results. Nothing too good and nothing too terrible. But then when you look at the individual results, right? And when we've talked about this numerous times, you have he's never suffered a bad non-conference loss. Like he's never lost to Morehead States or any of the bye games. Now he's won many of them in close fashion, but he never lost those. But the difference is anytime he would play top level competition, and I don't say anytime, but anytime he would play somebody with a pulse and they got the Indiana team got down, they'd get beaten to death like a drum. And that's kind of been part of the story, I guess, with how Indiana teams how things have unfolded in certain situations under Mike Woodson. So who will it be for, who will be the heir apparent? Who knows? I'm sure we'll continue to dive into different scenarios over the next several weeks. I feel like Wednesday we talked very heavily about Chris Beard. I unfortunately didn't really have enough time to ask Mike DeCourcy about his thoughts on Chris Beard. We didn't really get into too many names specifically. There were some names that he brought up that we kind of dove into, more so than we did with Zach Osterman, maybe. And so that's a little bit different, something different to look forward to, I guess, when it comes to that conversation. So, and then on the other side of that, we'll get into a couple of other basketball matters, some, I guess, little pieces of news that we'll discuss. We also have a couple of Indiana football things I want to get into, and then Indiana baseball season begins this weekend. So we're not going to do a super deep dive into baseball right now, but it does make me, I tell you what, I wish I had thought about this or remembered it earlier this week, because I would have reached out to somebody to get on that would be a good baseball guest to kind of preview the upcoming season. And we could still do that early on and just kind of get somebody else's thoughts, someone who's more closely invested with the baseball program than myself, and kind of maybe get their thoughts on where they think this team, what the ceiling is and that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure they return Devin Taylor. I hope that's his name. I know they've had a star. I think he'll be a junior this year. And it's amazing that they've been able to hold on to him. But they do return. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Devin Taylor, he'll be a junior. He's been really good for Indiana the last couple of seasons. And the fact that he's back for a third year, I would assume would potentially be his last year in college, because baseball, very similar to football, where you have to wait until your junior year, or at least your third year of eligibility. I don't know if that's changed. Don't quote me on that if that's incorrect. But it used to be to where you, after your third season, you could jump to major. You could go to enter the MLB draft at that point. You could also still do it out of high school, I believe. Very unique thing with baseball, being able to be drafted out of high school. But if you don't take take the bid that you get, or the option, I guess, then you can go to college and play and then try to improve your draft stock for a couple of years later. So yeah, very unique way they do things, of course, in baseball. And so, yeah, Indiana getting Taylor back. I don't really know a whole lot about the rest of the returning roster. Some of the names on here I'm familiar with. And I guess we're going ahead and getting into baseball now. I didn't expect to fully dive into it, but I guess now that I've already dipped my toes in, we can go ahead and get get this conversation out of the way. And I don't like to phrase it like that, but I guess that's really that's kind of what it is. But in terms of the names, there are a few that I recognize. I don't, again, as somebody, I used to be a really big Indiana baseball fan when I was younger, back when I had more time to consume nothing but college sports, right? Back when I didn't have to be an adult. And I think I've told the story before. I told the story on this show, I believe. The very first Indiana baseball game I ever attended was Indiana versus Kentucky. Back when it was probably the year 2010, 15 years ago. It's something along those lines. Maybe that's not. It was around that time frame. And Indiana was facing Kentucky at Simbauer Field, of course. I don't know if that field exists anymore. I know they have Bart Kaufman Field, but of course the old Simbauer, one of the, I mean, my gosh, when that stadium, I mean, what a horrible place to play college baseball. The facilities that Indiana baseball and really softball used to have to deal with before Simbauer Field and then before Bart Kaufman and then Andy Moore Field. I mean, the Simbauer was, I mean, comparatively speaking, ugly as sin. Of course, when I was a sixth grader or whatever it was going to that game, I didn't know any better. But Indiana played Kentucky that fateful day in a midweek game, and they won that game in extra innings, like 18-17. Indiana had to make like a 8 or 9, 10 run comeback in the final inning to even get it to extra innings. And that was my introduction to Indiana baseball. And I believe Jared Sabrin, for those who may remember that name, if you're an Indiana baseball fan, I think he was the guy who got the game-winning hit against Kentucky in that matchup. Of course, that was just a few years before Kyle Schwarber and Sam Travis, of course, the legendary Indiana team that got to the College World Series. Tracy Smith saw kind of the latter years of his tenure with baseball. And then, of course, Chris Lemonis took over before he ended up moving on to Mississippi State, won a College World Series there. And then now we've got Jeff Mercer, and he's had the program. I mean, it's really since Tracy Smith onward, there's been a nice, kind of passing of the torch, if you will, line of coaches that have been able to maintain a certain level of success with the program. Now, it's always going to be tougher to be at the elite tier when you're Indiana or really any Big Ten program, because in baseball, of course, it's your scholarships are a lot more limited, and you're always going to be, even more so than in football, like the SEC and the ACC will always be the top dogs in baseball. And I don't think there will ever be anything that changes that, I wouldn't think. It doesn't mean you can't win. It doesn't mean you can't get to the College World Series. We've seen Indiana and a few other Big Ten teams do it over the last several seasons. Illinois had some good years. Michigan, of course, as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. We'll try to keep an eye out. I don't think I'll follow it as heavily as maybe I'll follow it more so than I usually do, just because of the state of basketball. But there's so much going on with basketball. But I may reach out to somebody, talk a little bit about the baseball season here soon, before we get too far into it. Just I want to get a feel of what to expect. I don't want to just look at the results and be like, okay, it is what it is, but I want to know who's really good for this team, right? So that'll do it for our baseball talk. Didn't expect to get into it that soon into the show, but hey, sometimes you go down, you guys know how this works. Sometimes I go down a rabbit hole, and once you fall down far enough into it, you just have to keep going until you get to the other side of it. So that's what ended up happening here. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and we'll get back into what I'm sure many of you are really here for, and that is for the Indiana basketball head coaching discussion. Can this team make a run at, getting to the NCAA tournament? It really begins. I mean, it began with that win against Michigan State, but Indiana most certainly has to beat UCLA tonight if they want any shot, if they want to keep any hope at getting back on the right side of the bubble and potentially getting into the big dance in Mike Woodson's final season. So we I don't know how much we'll talk specifically about Indiana UCLA today, but tonight we will have a post game wrap up show. Myself and Kyler Staley will react to whatever happens on the floor between Indiana and UCLA at Assembly Hall. And I kind of hope, not only do I hope Indiana wins because I'm a fan of Indiana, but I hope they win because I just don't want people to think Mick Cronin should be the coach. Kind of like the Dusty May thing from last week. But even more so here. I don't need anybody thinking Mick Cronin is the guy for Indiana. So without further ado, let's bring on from the Sporting News and Big Ten Network, Mr. Mike DeCourcy. We're going to talk a little more about this Indiana basketball coaching search. Joining us now from the Sporting News and Big Ten Network, it is none other than Mike DeCourcy. I appreciate you taking some time to chat with me today, Mike.
Oh, happy to do it, John. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Glad to have you on the show for the first time. And of course, a lot of talk around Indiana basketball as usual, but of course, more so with, other reasons, not just things going on the court, but of course, the coaching search or the coaching search that is about to happen, I should say. But before we dive fully into that, I do want to ask you kind of where you think the rest of this current season could go. Of course, Indiana gets easily their biggest win of the season against Michigan State, I feel like, on the road earlier this week. But at the same time, when you have a lame duck head coach, things are a little wonky sometimes. So how do you kind of foresee things potentially playing out for the remainder of this season?
Well, I think it in a lot of ways, it's really up to the players. And I know that it's always up to the players. But when you think about the fact that this is a team that has always had enough ability to win in the Big Ten, to win against the better non-conference opponents, it's always had enough ability. It's just a question of them putting it in the right places at the right time. And some of that is strategic coming from the coaches, and some of it is execution coming from the players. But it's really up to the squad, how they respond to the coach that they now know. Obviously, for Trey Galloway, Anthony Leo, players like that, it matters to them who the next coach will be, in the sense of they will be alums that have a deep investment in the Indiana basketball program. But it doesn't matter to them relative to who will coach them next. And that may not matter to a number of the current IU players. There are several of them that will complete their eligibility this year. So they can focus on what do they want to do with what they have left. It's really up to them. Senioritis. When I was in high school, senioritis meant like putting your feet up and doing the minimum stuff that you could do to get by and get it over with. That was what we always thought it meant. And I've heard other people use it in the sense of it's coming to an end and I got to get it right now. And I don't really think that's what it means, because otherwise it wouldn't be categorized as some sort of ailment. I think it really means you're about ready to pack it in. Well, I mean, they can't afford to have senioritis. They have to put everything they have into being successful in the way that they did at Michigan State. And they have to continue that for 40 minutes. I mean, when they had Maryland at home, there was still plenty of time for them to define their season in a way that would be disconnected from what happened in the Bahamas, for instance. There was still plenty of time. And then they faced a situation wherein they had a lead. They had fought back to take a lead, and they had a foul to give, and they didn't spend it. They didn't spend it wisely. They didn't spend it foolishly. They didn't spend it. And Maryland winds up with an open three-pointer to win it. And then they ran a poor play that may or may not have been poorly designed, but certainly did not result in an even half-hearted shot to erase the mistake they had just made at the opposite end. And it was somewhat similar, although not identical, in the game at Purdue, wherein they gave a phenomenal performance and effort, especially effort. But then down the stretch, again, made a poor decision after things got difficult. a player runs down and takes a shot that is contested and for which there is no teammate available to rebound any miss. Those are the kinds of things that they have done far too consistently in the games that were competitive. And then there were far too many games that weren't competitive.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when, and I don't want to talk too much more about like the game specifically, but it felt like the way the Wisconsin game played out. I mean, that was kind of, it felt like that was, burying the season, if you will, burying everything that has happened under Mike Woodson, especially the last couple of seasons. And of course, that's after that game is when you saw things kind of move in the direction they currently are now. Do you see any specific benefit to finishing the season out and maybe finding a way to get into the tournament? Now, I know they got a lot of work to do if they're even going to get back into that conversation. But for the incoming regime, whoever it ends up being, do you see there being any specific benefit to having a good finish of the season like that? Because you may not have any of the guys currently on this roster on next year. It could be like a Louisville and Kentucky situation where you have brand new guys next year.
I don't think it does anything for the next regime, but it does for these players and for the fans. You get in, you're in. Someone who follows the Pittsburgh Steelers, there are a lot of complaints about the inability of their team to advance in the playoffs for however many years it's been since 2016, 8 years or whatever. There's a lot of complaints about that, but there are other fans who understand that getting there is a huge thing. It's not easy. It's not easy to get into the NCAA tournament. Whether it says Indiana on your jersey, Kentucky on your jersey, George Mason or whatever, even with 68 opportunities to get in, it's still not easy. And I think that's important to remember. So if this team were to somehow, and it's not impossible, it certainly would be totally antithetical to this team's resume to date, this team's personality to date, to put together the kind of consistent success that would be necessary to get them into March. It would be, but that doesn't make it impossible. I've seen teams flip seasons before. One I remember really well, Washington in 2004, at the start of February. I mean, they couldn't bounce the ball 3 times without knocking it off their foot. And then they won, I think, 9 out of 10, including a victory over a undefeated Stanford team, not undefeated in conference, undefeated on the final day of the regular season to get a high quality win. And they wound up in the tournament. And so it is possible to flip a season like that.
And another great example, too, UConn, before they won their back-to-back national championships in that first year where they won under Dan Hurley, they were having a pretty mediocre season before they got to the back half of the schedule and things just clicked. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen here with the last 6 or 7 games with Indiana, but to your point about turning things around, there's definitely that possibility, I feel like.
Yeah, it's available to them, and they've got enough quality in the resume. I'd have to look at it, but I'd say somewhere around 5 quad 1 wins, 4 to 5 quad 1 wins right now, including the one at Michigan State, which will be among the better wins anybody gets this year.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's possible, but this is about those guys. It's about what they want to do with what they have left, the time they have left as Indiana players. For a lot of them, this is their final stretch. The ones who've been there forever, like Leal and Galloway, and the ones who've been there a year, like Umar Ballo, those guys, this is their chance to have some fun. It's not been a lot of fun to this point, but there's still fun out there.
And then looking ahead, I guess past that point, everyone feels like most of the fans, they have their mind on what's next, which that's kind of how things usually go. If you're the administration, or if you're putting yourselves in the shoes of the administration, so I guess there's 2 different perspectives here. Who do you think Indiana will target as kind of their top candidate? And if you were Indiana, who would you target as kind of the top candidate?
Well, I think that they will make the calls on people like Dusty May. And I certainly would, especially given the fact that you have the extra time. There's no time crunch. Kentucky, you think about Kentucky Search, which was last April, after the Final Four. Their opening came about on Sunday before the championship game. And So, and they had a coach in place by the end of the week. They had to move a lot more quickly in going through the dream scenarios. I knew that they weren't going to get the ones that most people talked about: Nate Oates, Dan Hurley, and Scott True. I knew at that point that wasn't going to happen. I don't think that Indiana will wind up with Dusty May, although they have at least a slightly better shot given that Dusty's not entrenched and that he does have the tie. I don't think it's a huge shot because I think that Dusty made a decision. That Final Four was not going anywhere. He could have held on to it until IU opened. It wasn't that if he didn't spend it, he wasn't ever going to get that chance again. That Final Four had at least 3 to 5 years of enduring goodwill that he could have waited until IU opened, whether it was Mike, being moved out or Mike deciding to retire. He could have waited, and he chose, you know what, Michigan's coming. It's a great job. I'm going to do it. So that's a big part of why I don't think that it'll happen. Scott Drew now versus Scott Drew a year ago, he's having a rough year. I mean, rough by their standards. So is he maybe thinking about it a little bit more? I could go maybe. Nate Oates is not having a rough year. Nate's got a shot at another Final Four and maybe a national championship. So I do think that you have time to pick through those dream scenarios a little bit more. But the reality is that I don't think there has been an instance of true peer-to-peer movement since Roy Williams left Kansas to go to North Carolina in 2003. And he only did it really for 2 reasons. One, both his son and daughter had decided to locate in North Carolina, which meant access to family, grandchildren, all of that if he moved back. And 2, Dean Smith was very, very much involved in trying to convince him, look, I asked you once and you said no. I'm asking you again, please. We need this. And so he felt he owed Dean a ton, and honestly, he did, because Dean gave him the break that made him into a Hall of Fame coach. The break as a student manager or a student observer, and then the chance to be an assistant coach and all of that. So yeah, he did give him the break. And then Roy turned it into a Hall of Fame career. So I think it was fair to say that he did kind of owe him. And so he acted on it and went back. But we don't see that come up on a regular basis. Look at every job that has changed hands over the last 5 years. How many of them are big time program to big time program? I don't think there are any. Look at what Louisville is doing right now. Where'd they find Pat Kelsey? They found him at Charleston. Look at Kentucky right now. Again, BYU, Kentucky. They were both in 8 major conferences, but there's no one that outside of maybe Provo, Utah, that's going to argue that BYU is on the same level as Kentucky. So that's what you're looking at. And I think that, and I wrote this in my initial piece, that the advantage Indiana has, John, at this stage is that with the way college athletics has changed over the course of the last 3 years, there is a difference now between the standard Big 12 program, standard ACC program, and the Big 10, especially a program like Indiana, which has traditionally been an elite Big 10 program. But even your standard Big 10 program has that advantage. So that's where Indiana has an edge. And that's where I think that they'll find the next coach.
And I'm glad you mentioned Pat Kelsey and Mark Pope, just because those are 2 very recent examples and also fairly locally, and definitely locally in my neck of the woods. If Indiana goes that route, I think it should be, and you kind of already laid out a lot of this, I don't think fans should see whoever that would be as an underwhelming hire, or that the name Indiana has lost its luster, because I don't think that would be true at all. I think a guy that people have thrown around a few times already is Ben McCollum. I don't know how likely he is to go to Indiana per se. Some may think he will want the Iowa job if Fran McCaffrey ends up getting let go there, especially considering he's already a Drake and that sort of thing. And I believe he's from Iowa City. I could be incorrect about that. But if Indiana does go a route, the rising star, do you think that they could have, and this may be an obvious question, but you can elaborate a little bit more. Do you think they could have and find really good success early, especially with the way that things can turn around so quickly with the NIL transfer portal, all that stuff going on?
Oh, they could, absolutely. It's not guaranteed. I mean, it took Arkansas. They're still working through their initial hire, and they hired a Hall of Fame coach, and he brought a significant number of capable players who played for him last year at Kentucky. But building the right roster in that immediate circumstance is not easy. It's worked out for Louisville. I think it's helped Louisville to be in the ACC. I'm not going to say that they're not having a phenomenal year, especially for 1 year, instantaneous turnaround. But I think it does help to be in a conference where the challenges are fewer. This is a very poor ACC. I would say, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's the worst ACC in history.
It's very, and with the fact that Clemson is your number 2, and it's not even really a strong number 2 right now. And you got Louisville right behind them. The ACC's been very, very weird.
Yeah. So, but I don't want to diminish what Louisville's doing, because it's still astonishing, and Pat's doing an amazing job. At Kentucky, they're doing it in instantaneous fashion in the most difficult league that's probably ever existed. So it can be done.
Very true.
It's about building the right group, building the right roster, covering point guard. That's the thing that a lot of coaches are missing, is not getting point guard right. And I'm not saying it's easy, but if you're wondering why this particular team is not what it should be, it's often because they don't cover the point guard spot. Now, like if you look at Michigan, another somewhat instantaneous turnaround, they have Namari Burnett and a few others, Will Cheddar, who's been there for a while. But the core of their roster is new. And their point guard position, Trey Donaldson, is not a conventional point guard. But they built around where with Danny Wolf and what he's able to do in terms of facilitating offense, they just need Trey to turn over maybe a little less than he does, and then make all the big shots he does, which he does at a phenomenal rate, and guard his man, which he does well. So you have to cover that. So those are the things to watch. Mike never got it right at point guard. He tried with Xavier Johnson. It worked to the extent that it worked, maybe better than I originally anticipated it would, based on my observation of him at Pitt. But then he kept getting hurt, and there wasn't a backup plan. And then this year, he brings in a couple of guys from the Pac-12 who aren't really point guards, and doesn't really design the thing to work with those guys. And he winds up going back to having to have Trey Galloway initiate offense again, which Trey always does a fine job at that, but it diminishes what he does best, which is facilitate from the wing and make the occasional open shot and guard his man at a high level. And he's as good a facilitator at that position on the wing as there is in college basketball, but he never gets to do it. So that's why Indiana hasn't won on a consistent basis under Mike. And that's something that the next coach, whoever they are, whatever level they come from, has to address.
This may be, hopefully it's not too cliche of a question, but people always talk about getting it right. People say that, oh, the next hire is always the most important hire. Indiana's gone through this process way too many times since Tom Crean was let go. When you think about the importance, and I guess, I think people overstate the legacy of the program, especially with Indiana, far too often, especially when you think about Bob Knight and all that sort of thing. Do you think the importance of this hire, is it what people are going to make it out to be, at least when it comes to, getting back and being competitive regularly in the Big Ten, and of course, eventually getting back to an elusive Final Four, which they haven't been able to do since the early 2000s, of course?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, is it the most important hire ever? Well, it's the most important hire since the last one, which was too recent. Before that, and too recent. Yeah. I mean, when you said they've done it too many times since Tom, I mean, honestly, they've done it too many times since Bob.
Fair
since
enough.
2000 when Bob left, because then you're hiring, you're going interim, and then you decide to make that permanent, and then you decide that it's not working, and then you bring in Kelvin Sampson, and you get that wrong, not because Kelvin's not brilliant, because he is. He's one of the best. But you couldn't, in that circumstance, hire a coach whose program at Oklahoma was in the final stages of an NCAA investigation / adjudication. You couldn't. I mean, how do you do that when you know that if anything goes wrong, and really the slightest thing went wrong under Kelvin at IU in terms of the NCAA rulebook,
something that wouldn't even be illegal nowadays.
No, I mean, it was a traffic ticket. I mean, it's what it was. But because of the circumstance, it became a conflagration. And so every time they've had the opportunity with Tom, I thought they did a great job, and that he did a fine job, but they were looking for him to do a great job, and he didn't quite get that there. And so they thought they could try again. And then they hired Arch, and I always thought that Arch was a good enough coach to succeed, but I always wondered about, would Indiana be the right fit for him because of his personality? He's not the most outgoing person. And I think that ultimately, and the COVID thing happened when it did, and him hitting a not great window of Indiana basketball talent. Obviously Trace was there, and Trace became an all-time great. Romeo Langford was there, and Romeo did the one and done thing. But other than those two players, there weren't as many Gary Harrises out there through that window when he was in place. And so for that reason, I think that he just had bad timing, and it just didn't work. And so there's always something. But the one thing that you can say about Indiana, the enthusiasm hasn't waned. The facilities are great. The talent in state, with the exception of that bad window for Arch, has been exceptional. And I think it's still, by and large, inclined to become Hoosiers. So I still think that there is a lot of value, a lot of appeal to the Indiana job. But I just don't think that if you have to hire Mick Cronin, and I mean, like, as in when UCLA did it, I don't mean he's coming. I mean, like, if you have to hire Mark Pope, if you have to hire Pat Kelsey, and you don't get Bruce Pearl, and you don't get Scott Drew or Nate Oates or whatever the fantasy of the day is, and I don't, fantasy is a tough word, but whatever the dream of the day is, that's a better word. If you don't get that person, that doesn't mean your job is diminished. It means that you did what everybody else is doing. Your job is to do it better.
Mike, I appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to promote from the sporting news that's coming up for you?
Yeah, we're going to continue to have regular coverage of college basketball as we get closer to March. I've got a bunch of different features coming. I'm working on one about Rick Pitino and his splash at St. John's. My colleague, Bill Bender, will continue to do bracket updates regularly for sporting news. And you can find me on BTN every Saturday in the games that we televise, as well as the big show and our pregame shows every Saturday, with the exception of the 22nd between now and the end of the regular season. And my own brackets, which I do for Fox Sports, will be Tuesdays and Fridays at CBB on Fox. And also on Tuesdays, every Tuesday at noon from now until the end of the season, you can find me appearing on Big Ten Today at noon Eastern time on BTN to discuss the latest brackets.
Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News and Big Ten Network, I appreciate you taking some time. It's been a while since you and I've chatted, and I feel like this went really well. So I look forward to hopefully doing this sometime in the future.
Happy to join you, John.
Big thanks, of course, once again to Mike DeCourcy for his time, and hopefully we'll have the chance to chat with him once again sometime in the future, whether that be about the coaching search, whether that be about who Indiana ends up hiring over the next month or so. And what's one thing you heard during that conversation? I mean, this is probably going to be, something that drags out a while, and not for any bad reason, but just because of there's none of the guys, and there's not a single coach on Indiana's hot board, if you will, other than one that is someone that that is currently available, right? Everyone else has got teams that they're still trying to, make the most of their time with. And, whether that's Bruce Pearl or any of the other guys that we've talked about, it's going to be a while before Indiana really knows who they end up hiring. Now, that doesn't mean they can't have conversations behind closed doors, because they probably will. And it's one of those things where, because of that aspect alone, once the team that has the head coach that will eventually become Indiana's head coach, once they bow out of their season, whenever that may be, the transition will probably be fairly quick, I would assume, based on, I'm sure Indiana will have numerous conversations with several different head coaches, with several different programs between now and whenever they hire them. And one other thing I want to talk a little bit more about too, that Mike DeCourcy, that he got into, is the fact that, like, you see the big programs always talk about, they got to go get this guy from this power program. They're Indiana. They can pull a Bruce Pearl or whatever. Kentucky thought they could pull out off of Dan Hurley. Louisville thought they could pull off Scott Drew, that sort of thing. Kentucky also thought they could get Scott Drew. But I mean, Mike DeCourcy is exactly right, especially when you think about, excuse me, you don't see a lot of Power 5 or Power 4, whatever you want to call it. You don't see a lot of jumping around in basketball, specifically from jobs like that. So I think it's far more likely that Indiana will end up going the route. I mean, they'll shoot their shot at the big names for sure, but I don't think we should go ahead and, I mean, do we say rip the Band-Aid off? Does that fit in this scenario? It wouldn't surprise me. I don't think fans should be surprised if Indiana goes the route of a Ben McCollum or someone along those lines. It doesn't have to be McCollum, but I find myself, I think it's the comparisons to Signetti that get me. I think it makes it too easy to fall in love with the potential of that hire, and maybe it would be completely wrong for the university. I don't know. Nobody knows until we see it in action. I'm sure McCollum isn't as, maybe I'm wrong about this too, but who knows? Maybe I don't expect McCollum to, excuse me, I don't expect him to be as abrasive, if you will, as Curt Signetti was whenever he was hired. Because, I mean, the Indiana basketball program, it doesn't need the same kind of hyping up as the football program did. Like, Indiana football has never had any sustained momentum. Now, it's been a while since Indiana basketball has had any real legitimacy, part of their name. You heard Zach Osterman say the other day, like, Indiana football has been to the postseason more times in the last 10 years than Indiana basketball. And I know the way to qualify for the postseason in both sports is a lot different. Like, if you go 500 in basketball, you're not making the big dance. You can go 500, sometimes below 500 in football, and make a bowl game, depending on how many bowl slots there are available. So, the qualifications to get in are a little bit different. But it is still worth noting that the worst program in the history of college football has been to the postseason more times than one of the more revered college basketball programs of all time. I do think I'm very confident that Indiana is going to get this right. And I think maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I think this day and age, especially when you look at the NIL war chest that we've talked about several times, I think it makes the job more attractive than it used to be. And a lot of people used to think that, just coming to Indiana is all coaches need. Like, oh, they'll just want to be at Indiana. And there are guys who probably fit that profile. But coaches nowadays, they want to know that they're going to be taken care of financially, not necessarily, or not just when it comes to their own salary, but they want to know that their players are going to have, they're going to have plenty to offer when it comes to getting guys to come, getting recruits interested, because, I mean, it's all about the dollar now. As sad as it is, especially for the old guard, those who have seen college sports in their purest form longer than I have. I mean, that's never things are never going back to that. And these are like what we get with college football and college basketball and the like nowadays. It's basically semi-professional sports. It's the minor leagues. It's like, if you're using, I mean, if it's kind of like AAA baseball, but on another step above that, it's kind of in between. Maybe that's a very weird comparison. Excuse me, my apologies. I'm also recording the show, if you haven't figured this out by now, at night on Thursday. And I don't have my coffee with me. Like I say, that's one of my least favorite things about recording at night is that I don't have my coffee with me. Now, I used to be able to do that whenever I didn't get up at 3 a.m. because I could drink. My cutoff, I used to do this. I don't know if I've mentioned this before. My coffee cutoff used to be 8 p.m. I used to like drinking coffee that late into the evening because I would stay up till sometimes 11:30, midnight even, and wouldn't bat an eye because I wouldn't need to be up and really getting rolling until 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, 8 a.m. and 3 a.m. big difference, of course. So yours truly has to settle for a little nighttime water action, and it does the job. But sometimes at night when you're recording, the pipes aren't as strong as they are during the day. Anyway, that's now that I've gotten off topic, this is probably a good time to transition into some of the other topics that I had in store for us here as we get close to the final few minutes of today's show. But let's go ahead and go over this little piece. It's a scheduling piece of news that maybe some of you have already seen. Indiana has added another non-conference opponent to its 2025-2026 schedule, and that is the Marquette Golden Eagles out of the Big East. They will play in a neutral site matchup in Chicago at the United Center, of course, where the Chicago Bulls play and where the Big Ten tournament has been held numerous times, I should say. That game does not have a date, but I think it's a really good neutral site matchup. I'm not usually the biggest fan of doing neutral site games, but when you think about the alumni base in Chicago for Indiana, you'll have a really good Indiana turnout there. And then with Marquette, they're in Milwaukee, I think. If I'm wrong on that, then apologies, but I'm pretty sure they're in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is not very far from Chicago. So I'm sure you'll get a really good contingent of both fan bases in Chicago for that particular matchup whenever it does end up being played. Last time the Hoosiers met up with the Golden Eagles, it was in 2018. Indiana won 96-73. That game was in Bloomington, and Indiana currently holds the all-time record lead 8-2 in that series. So, and that game will join, of course, the return of the Kentucky series next year, when that game will be on December 20th at Rupp Arena. And so what a game for whoever the next head coach is to, have that on the schedule. And I know that means more to us as fans than it probably does to whoever ends up becoming the next head coach at Indiana. But it's so exciting to have that series come back. We haven't seen Indiana and Kentucky play in one of their home arenas since 2012. And of course, or 2011, I should say. It was the 11-12 season. But since then, the only time they've met up has been twice in the NCAA tournament, once in that same season where Kentucky went on to win the national championship, and then once in 2016 when Yogi Ferrell and Thomas Bryant, Troy Williams and that crew got the best of the Wildcats. And so Indiana currently holds the most recent win against them, but that was nearly 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, I should say, since we're in 2025. But it'll be nice to see that game return. Who knows what to expect with that, especially because we have no idea what Indiana's roster will look like. I'm not sure how many players Kentucky will retain from one year to the next. I'm sure they won't be starting from scratch the way they did with this year. And of course, Mark Pope, an entirely different personality than John Calipari. And I don't know what kind of personality Indiana's going to have, but I would assume, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, unless it's like a Dusty May. If it's Dusty May, you're going to have two pretty you're going to have two head coaches that, they don't really fit the rivalry personality, right? If it's Dusty May versus Mark Pope, they're both very good human beings. And so maybe you won't get much of the rivalry banter that you used to get with John Calipari. And I don't know how much Tom Crean ever really participated in, that sort of nonsense. But Calipari was always ruffling feathers, and he still is down in Arkansas. And I don't know if I ever had a chance to react to this, but seeing him go into Kentucky and, kind of have the last laugh at Rupp Arena, that's what a heck of a matchup that was. I know that's kind of old news now, so it's not worth reacting too much to. But it was pleasing for me to see John Calipari, go in and piss off the UK fans. So, and I'm curious about this too, especially for those who have, been around longer than me, of course. Who do you see as more of a rival to Indiana in basketball? Is it Purdue or is it Kentucky? Because I've always said or assumed that if you lived in southern Indiana, particularly close enough to the Kentucky border, you may think Kentucky is kind of the bigger rival for Indiana. But maybe you wouldn't say that if you're somebody who's closer to Bloomington or Indianapolis and you're not surrounded by as many Kentucky fans as you are when you're closer to the southern border. So I'm curious. Let me know in the comments. I don't know if we're going to get to any comments today. I know we'll save some more of those for Monday, but we'll reload that bank a bit. And I am curious. Feel free to let me know. And I say feel free. I want to know, Kentucky or Purdue, who's the bigger rival for? And I'm talking basketball specifically, of course. Indiana and Kentucky haven't played in football in so long, but I'd also love to see the Bourbon Barrel series return in football, but that probably will never happen, especially in this day and age in college football, where the idea is to schedule as easy as you can in the non-con, it seems like, especially if you're part of either the Big Ten or the SEC. Speaking of football, and Indiana football in particular, there were a couple of players invited to the 2025 NFL Combine, one of those being Curtis Rourke, of course, the quarterback who will be forever revered in Indiana football lore. And I tell you what, I'm not going to get too much into, what, his numbers or anything like that. But whoever Curtis Rourke ends up getting drafted for, I don't know if he's going to be starting immediately. He probably won't. But if he does, that's going to be who I root for in the NFL next year. And if my wife listening, she's going to be upset because she wants me to root for the Bills. And I'll still root for the Bills. But hey, maybe he'll end up being the backup for the Bills. I don't know if there's any scenario where that happens. But that, I guess, would be the ideal scenario. Or the Colts. I'd love to see them play for the Colts, too. So we'll see what happens with Curtis Rourke. And then the other name that got invited to the NFL Combine, C.J. West, defensive lineman. Good to see somebody on the defensive side of the ball be represented from Indiana, because it used to be, I feel like Indiana and defensive line used to just scream inadequacy. And now that Indiana can be competitive and at times very, I don't want to say elite, but, close to that level on that side of the ball, it just shows how far we've come when it comes to, how good this team actually, or program can actually be under the right, regime and those guiding everyone. And then along the same lines, this is Indiana football related, but it's also kind of, there's one other thing I want to get into with this. On3 put out two different guys, I should say, put out two different lists with On3. It's their top 25 college football head coaches heading into the 2025-26 season. And both dudes had Curt Cignetti listed at number 12, which is a hell of a compliment. In one list, he's got Brett Bielema is right behind Indiana, or Curt Cignetti, at number 13. And then right ahead of him is Josh Heupel at Tennessee. I mean, I think that's a very fair placement. I mean, anywhere in the top 25 probably would have pleased fans in general, but I think many people think he's very near the top level of head coaches in college football. And if he can continue the level of success that Indiana had last year into successive seasons, he'll only be more highly regarded, I should say, in the future, and tougher to hold on, I should say, as well. In the other list, again, he's still at number 12. Right behind him is Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State. I think that's also very fair, considering he also kind of did the exact same thing Indiana did this year. Took an Arizona State team that was projected dead last in the Big 12. Indiana was second to last, and then took Arizona State all the way to the college football playoff, winning their conference, as a matter of fact. There was an argument. I did see, our friend Dustin Schutte had put this out on social media back when they were voting for Coach of the Year. He said he thought Kenny Dillingham should have been Coach of the Year over Curt Cignetti. And there's an argument for that. I mean, both of them had very low expectations. Both of them greatly surpassed them. Both of them achieved almost the exact same thing, but you can almost the argument Kenny Dillingham has over Cignetti is that he won his conference whenever he was projected dead last. Now, granted, the Big 12, not nearly the juggernaut of a conference that the Big 10 has become. And then you'd also argue, of course, for Indiana's sake, is that they've never had any expectations, right? Now, I don't really know Arizona State's football history, but it's not nearly, it can't be as bad as Indiana's. So I would assume that's what weighted Indiana getting the nod with Cignetti as opposed to Kenny Dillingham. But both of them in this other list listed 12 and 13, and then right above Cignetti in this list is Mario Cristobal of Miami. I think it's also very fair placement for him. But one thing about this second list that's very interesting is the inclusion of Bill Belichick. And I understand what he did in the NFL, like the amount of Super Bowls that he won, like that's something that will probably never be matched, especially now that Andy Reid just lost a Super Bowl to the Eagles. It wouldn't surprise me if he ends up retiring here in the next few years. But how well will Bill Belichick, how well will his coaching style, especially nowadays, as old as he is, and maybe age shouldn't matter, but how well will this translate to college football at North Carolina? I mean, maybe he ends up taking the college football world by storm. Who knows? But to have him just below Kirk Ferentz and Sharon Moore, actually Sharon Moore, I've said he's a bum before. I do think Sharon Moore figured things out towards the end of the season. It felt like it was, I know they demolished Northwestern right before they faced Indiana. And then they made a valiant effort on the road against, of course, our Hoosiers and weren't able to get it done. But then they followed that performance up by defeating their arch rival on the road, Ohio State, who, of course, went on to win the national championship. So Sharon Moore, next year will be a very telling season for him on if he's the real deal or not. And if he has another mediocre season, it wouldn't surprise me if they decide to move on from him. Even if they do, let's just say they went 7-5 again in something, and you know, beat Ohio State. I mean, is beating Ohio State enough to satisfy you heading into the offseason? Now, this season, you know, when the season before was a national championship season, yeah, you can rectify a mediocre season with that. But I don't think Michigan fans will deal with that for much longer, especially when, as we always say, you can turn things around in a jiffy. But yeah, Bill Belichick, I don't think you should rank Bill Belichick just because you can't really – the only thing you can compare is his NFL resume, which almost none of these guys on the top 25 has an NFL resume. Now, some of them do. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I do know some of these guys that have had success at both levels at varying rates, of course. You know, but none of them have had that level as, you know, none of them, or what I should say is they've all been in college before now, not Bill Belichick. He's been an NFL lifer until now. And I'm looking forward to seeing how, you know, that works out next year. Like how, you know, how Deion Sanders was kind of the story of CFB for the last 2 seasons when it comes to coaches. Now it's going to be Bill Belichick, nationally, at least I should say. I'll be looking forward to seeing how, and I'll be rooting for him. I don't necessarily like him, but I don't dislike him, and I don't dislike North Carolina, and I don't really have an issue. Indiana doesn't play him. Maybe Indiana will get a shot at North Carolina in whether it be a bowl game or even the playoff. Who knows? But that will be interesting to follow along with for sure. All right. What else do we got here? Let's do one more. Let's do something. I almost missed this, but I thankfully caught this before. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear this music playing in the background. My wife's watching a TV show. I don't think it's bleeding through the microphone. Hopefully it's not. But I haven't done women's basketball shout out in a while. And I honestly, again, my fault for not doing so. And I don't even remember the last time, like where I left off. But we'll just start from the beginning of February for those who haven't had a chance to keep up with the women's team as much as maybe they do with some of the other programs. But starting February 2nd, Hoosiers defeated Nebraska 76-60. And this was coming off of their road trip where they went to Oregon and Washington. They beat Washington before and then lost to Oregon right before that. Then after that, they followed up their win against Nebraska with a win against Rutgers, 81-60. They then went on the road at Minnesota, lost 56-66. Stayed on the road and lost 67-70 earlier this week. And then tomorrow, they'll have rival Purdue in town. Game will be broadcast on the Big Ten Network, but a big weekend for the Lady Hoosiers as they will play their arch nemesis and try to get a big win. And I don't really know their tournament prospects right now, the Indiana team, but they are currently 15-9, 7-6 in the conference. And I would assume with, I don't know how good a lot of their wins are. I know they have a win against Baylor. That was back in the Bahamas, back when they were in the top 25. They also have a road win at Iowa. That was a top 25 win. So they have some good wins. I'm sure if they finish the season strong, they'll find themselves in the NCAA tournament. But you want to keep things heading in that right direction with the win over your rival, of course. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and wrap up the shows for this week. And hopefully you guys enjoyed yourselves. Hopefully you enjoyed the new guests that we had on the show this week. And I don't know how I'm gonna try more often to get new names for the show. Maybe at least once a week. I'm not going to promise anything, but that's kind of always been my goal, is to get somebody a little more unique each and every week, along with some of our mainstays. So we'll try to do that to the best of our ability. And also, real quick, or a couple real quicks. First, another reminder for tonight's post-game wrap-up show against UCLA. Me and Kyler will have you covered for immediate reaction for everything that happens between the Hoosiers and the Bruins right here on Hoosier Illustrated. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notifications bell to know when we go live for the post-game wrap-up show. And then also for Monday, I plan on having a show right now, and this has nothing to do with President's Day, other than the fact that because other people at my job have decided to take off work, that is adding to my work and the length of time that I will need to stay on Monday. So if I'm able to put together a show on Sunday afternoon for Monday, then we'll have a show for Monday. But I do have a fairly busy weekend ahead. So if there ends up not being a show on Monday, I'll make a post out onto the socials as well as on YouTube. But I don't want that to be the case. I want to have a show on Monday. Also, we'll have a show on Wednesday as well. But I'll also looking at the next Friday. And I know I'm kind of I feel like I'm just dumping right now. I'm not meaning to do that. But next Friday is my wife and I will be out of town for our baby moon. And so unless I put together a show on Thursday, like I'm doing right now for next Friday, then I might take Friday off as well. I don't want to have to do both. So we'll have to just wait and see. Just wanted to let you guys know, for those who are still sticking around to the end of the show, there may be some slight tweaks to the schedule next week. We'll have to wait and see. But until then, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.